Hey everybody, Ryan here at Plague Scythe Studios. Welcome back to the Tone Engineer and what should be the last big ride around the channel from the original Pod Pro and by extension, the Valvestate 8200. This might just be the penultimate turn of the millennium rig for two iconic stereo pieces of gear in this not 4, not even 5, but 6 cable method rig. If you were around for the earliest Tone Engineer episodes, you might recall that I put the original Pod Bean through the effects loop of the MG250 DFX to kind of augment a budget stereo amplifier setup, giving it more preamplifier sounds, adding some new effects, while still retaining some of the onboard digital effects of the 250 DFX. And you might consider this video to kind of be the last stop, the major extension of that concept and trying to kind of make up for some of the faults of that rig, or at least accomplish some goals that that one could not, including, but not limited to, being able to retain the tones of the original amplifier's, well, preamp. And that accomplishes this and a lot more. So the seeds of this concept have been there for a while, but I thought I would take advantage of a couple really unique features of especially the 8200, but really the combination of these two pieces of gear together to show something that you really can't do very easily, and not to say this was easily done, outside of most like digital modeling stuff where you could set these kind of parallel and serial configurations being switched on the fly. So let's start by taking a brief overview of what's actually going on here in this 6 cable method rig. At least I'm pretty certain it's 6 cables. I very well could have lost track because most of these cables I'm using 2 of the same type, but I'll correct myself in post if that's the case. Whatever the case, a lot of people have probably heard of the 4 cable method, and whether you know it or not, if you're using a single pedal in front of an amplifier, that is technically a 2 cable method, right? 1 cable in, 1 cable out, you're done. When we talk about 4 cable method, we're generally talking about some type of multi-effects unit being able to interface with both the front of an amplifier and within the effects loop. And what that allows you to do is have effects both in front of the amp and within the effects loop at the same time. And obviously they're going to be different most of the time, whether you have a compressor or overdrive pedal in front or stuff like, wet, echo, or modulation effects in the effects loop, or even noise gates in both positions. That's generally the whole point of a 4 cable method. So what happens when you add a couple more cables and the ability to play in stereo? Well, in this instance at least, largely in part thanks to the Marshall Valvestate 8200's dual effects loops, you're actually able to kind of swap where the effects go depending on which switches you have engaged and depending on what amp models and effects are active on the Pod Pro itself. This is not a pretty rig. This is not something I would expect anybody to replicate for real. This has a ton of problems, especially noise. You can kind of expect that with some of this older gear. But there's also the fact that with these effects loops, you can't disable them, which is a huge bummer. And we'll go to explain why I have some of these outboard pedals to make this even work at all, at least in being able to switch between the configurations in mostly real time. And in fact, there's actually a couple scenarios here where I really need another switch or a stereo switch to be able to disable and enable a couple different signal legs going into the amplifier. But what I'm really going after here are 4 distinct signal chains and the ability to be able to switch between them with really the press of a switch or multiple switches simultaneously. And the first couple are kind of obvious. I want to be able to use the 8200 by itself, including the preamps, including all of the stereo effects. I want to be able to use the Pod Pro by itself by feeding it through the stereo power amp of the 8200. Then comes the combinations. I want to be able to use the Valvestate's preamps, but the effects off of the Pod Pro and vice versa. But more critically, I want to be able to use the amp models of the Pod Pro through the chorus and reverb effects of the stereo 8200. And realistically, a couple of these permutations are just not necessary because any sane person would have a dry stereo power amp and just have all of those effects, whether you're juggling, kind of playing the pedal dance or not. All of those things would be discrete modules or discrete pedals. You probably aren't going to necessarily care about keeping every effect if you're using something like this as your stereo power amp platform. But this goes to show that it can be done. And it's a pain in the ass, but it can be done if you have some type of really capable amplifier or multi-effects unit that has just this otherworldly sound or effect that you can't get anywhere else. So let's talk through the logic of how I actually accomplish this and why I don't necessarily recommend you doing it, but it is a pretty cool exercise nonetheless. Starting at the end of the signal chain first, we have all the tones passing through a stereo Mesa Boogie oversized rectifier cabinet with their Mesa V30 speakers. I've got an SM57 on the right slant speaker and some Sennheiser something or another on the left because I broke my matching 57 not too long ago. RIP, doesn't really matter. Some EQ correction in post, you won't even notice they're different microphones. And as much as I would have liked to probably had a stereo Marshall sound, this is the most capable cabinet I own. And, V30s do fit kind of the theme of the late 90s going into early 2000s. So no problem there. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter. What matters the most here is that this thing can accept a stereo signal, because none of this really has the appeal if it doesn't have the stereo side of things, because that is where the lush chorus tones of the 8200 come from. And that is something you'll be hearing in probably about half of these tones. For the 8200 itself, you'll see me flip back and forth between the normal and boost channel. I'll always have OD2 engaged on the boost channel. It's really the only one worth playing for me. And the normal channel, I will go back and forth 1 or 2 times. I am having to boost this thing because, as you guys probably know if you watch the other videos on this amp, it is not the 8100's preamp. It is not nearly as articulate or high gain. So that's where you'll see the super overdrive come into play a couple times. And this is something that it doesn't really matter where you put it in the signal chain. You could put it absolutely first where I want to talk about it, but I had it in between the Valvestate and this switch. We'll talk about that later, but really you could put it anywhere. You could put this in front of the pod. It doesn't matter, but I wanted to have this amplifier be boosted to have some type of usable high gain sound there. Besides dialing in the tone stack to be kind of the stereotypical Valvestate scooped thing, the most important controls are in the effects loop section. Here, I have the effects dialed in to about 9, 10 o'clock most of the time. This is mostly on the dry side. And what this is really for is 100% wet effects, something that you would put through just a 100% delay line or 100% mixed in vibrato, and then you would put the dry to wet effect mix at about 50%, and then you would have kind of that sound that you're looking for. Because a lot of these effects loop back in the day, just like my single rectifier was stock before I modified it, they're really expecting some type of rack unit. But that's not what I actually have. It is a physical rack, but it's not the type of effect I have. So I kept this dialed in low because we do need a mixture of both depending on which effects loop we're using at the time. And you're going to kind of have to compensate that not only with the channel volume and master volume of this, but the output and channel volume of the Pod Pro, or if you were going to replicate this, whatever you're using in its stead. This does have some knock-on effects later that, again, cause some complications, but we'll talk about that as it arises. And for the chorus section, these are the settings I used for chorus A and chorus B. I'll flip back and forth a couple times, mostly leaning on the chorus A mode as it's a little more subtle. Not nearly a swishy flanger triangle wave type of sound. So that does it for the Valvestate itself. Out of this 6U rack case, the only pieces of gear I'm actually using are the Pod Pro and these two pedals here. So as it turns out, the empty space is actually more important than most of the filled ones. But you could implement the Sonic Maximizer in the Studio Quad V2 if you wanted to. Not the point here. I kind of did all the effects I wanted with just the Pod Pro. So on this, I'm going to be cycling through multiple presets, and it's really important to have them set up as presets because to be able to use this thing in the effects loop and be able to have it play nice with the preamp here, you basically have to play kind of this bypass game. And really, like I said, I need another switch to do this the most clean way. But for a lot of these presets, what I actually have selected as the amp model is the tube preamp, which is the cleanest thing on board. It's not very transparent in the sense that this thing's low sampling rate does limit it in terms of the high frequency and low frequency cutoff. You're not really going to notice that because we're already going through a set of guitar speakers anyway. It doesn't really matter. But to not induce any clipping or anything noticeable, I'm going to turn the drive down basically all the way to 0 anytime that I'm using the preamp of the 8200. That way there's really no noticeable change in the effects loop sound. Another consequence of the 8200 and Pod Pro not having effects loops that you can bypass with, say, a foot switch is that I'm constantly having to change the output volume on this thing between different demonstrations, and that is a limitation of this rig. Remember, in this 6-cable method setup, basically all cables are live at all times. This isn't like an FM series or AX8 or even a Helix or some other floorboard modeler where you can just turn off the effects loop block. This stuff's on, and unfortunately, there's no way to bypass it. So the more eloquent solution here would be to have some type of multi-effects unit that could silence the output, the stereo output, more specifically at the press of a button without having to do what I'm doing, or indeed implement some sort of kill switch between them, which is ultimately what this thing is. It's kind of difficult to keep track of because unfortunately, there's no difference in the light depending on which way I have this set. And the reason that is because this has no power to it on purpose. Now I could feed this thing some juice so you could see if the LED's on or off, but unfortunately that's not really accomplishing what I want it to do because this is a true bypass pedal. It doesn't matter what this is. Hell, I could throw a fuzz pedal in here if it was true bypass. What I want it to do is ultimately act as a kill switch, and that's what it's doing. So when I have this off, the signal's flowing through. When I have this on, because there's no power, the signal can't go anywhere. Just for good measure, I have the level turned all the way down, and I'll go ahead and, turn all these down for the B-roll cutaways, just so you know for certain that, this thing is off. But in general, what I'm trying to accomplish here is kill one of the effects loop inputs. Likewise, to be able to split the incoming signal between the Pod Pro and the 8200, I have it going through this loop switcher, which I generally use for like solid state gear. Basically, it's always going to the Pod Pro, but when I turn this on, it's going to the Marshall Valvestate. And actually, the effects send is coming back into this thing and being sent by extension into the front of the Pod Pro when this is on. Now, you don't want to do this at the same time when this thing has a high gain amp mode engaged because it's going to be squealy and you're putting high gain through high gain. But when I want to use the 8200's preamp, I can feed it through a clean input on the Pod Pro and basically bypass the amp modeling by going to 2 preamp and then use the onboard effects here. Or in the opposite condition, if I want to use the preamp modeling of the Pod Pro, I bypass the loop containing the 8200 preamp, and then I have 2 options. I can either use the onboard effects of the Pod Pro through the stereo loop of this, through those main outputs, or if I dial that main output all the way down or had that kill switch, then I would disable the switch here, or actually enable it by disabling the pedal, and then I'd be going through the mono return of this guy, and then I'd be able to use the onboard reverb and stereo chorus. Now you could still enable the effects on the Pod Pro through the mono return on the Valvestate. It just means you're going to lose that stereo spread, which on some of these effects doesn't matter, right? I mean, stuff like the tremolo or the compressor, you're probably not going to miss that whatsoever, but stuff like the rotary, the other modulation effects, and to a lesser extent, the delays, you do lose some spread. So I'm going to pretty much use them exclusively in the stereo mode, and most of the time, I'm not really looking to have that engaged at the same time of the Valvestate's chorus, so it doesn't really matter. I'll show a fairly cleaned up diagram of what's actually going on here, and hopefully that will dispel any confusion. I feel like I could talk about this for 2 hours and still not clarify every point, and hopefully point out a couple places that you could do, one or two things better than what I'm doing here. Despite that, though, even if you have this set up perfectly, there are still a couple of limitations with this rig. Number one, you're either sharing effects up front of these things, or, you have it limited to one or the other, you're still playing the pedal dance. But the bigger issue for me is this whole management of the volume between the two and the dry versus wet effects, because especially if you forget to disable this thing when it should be enabled or vice versa, you might accidentally put more of the wet effects signal through here than the dry signal, and there is a balance there because the more effect you have, the less chorus sound you get out of this. Because remember, if you somehow send the stereo and mono stuff at the same time, that stereo stuff is not affected by this, right? Unfortunately, the reverb and the chorus on here are in that mono effects return circuit going into the stereo power amp. You don't get to take advantage of this if you are sending it through the stereo power amp, which again has its pros and cons, because you could, keep this on, flip between a couple of them, and, you're not necessarily getting the same chorus sound both times. If you think about that ahead of time, it's fine. But if you aren't real careful about this, you can run into situations where the chorus isn't as strong on this, or the reverb isn't as strong on this as you might think. So you really have to dial everything ahead of time and make sure when you switch between them, it sounds exactly the way you think it should. Hence why I was down here in the, kind of 9 o'clock to 10 o'clock region to give this as much of the wet chorus effect as possible when I was using it, while still being able to live with the consequential decrease in signal to noise ratio coming from the Pod Pro. So yeah, it's messy. It's kind of outlandish, not something that I think is realistic to implement in most people's rigs, but if nothing else, let this be a simple celebration of two pieces of gear who have two effects loops each, one mono, one stereo on both units. So with that, let's start with a couple relatively, at least in this rig, relatively simple use cases by listening to the 8200 by itself, kind of one last time for its trip around the channel as well, and then we'll go from there. Now let's disable that preamp loop, dial up the Pod Pro output, not worry about the onboard chorus or reverb, and have some tones exclusively from the Pod Pro through a real analog solid state power amp. And this should be kind of a good representation, I think, minus adding tubes in the equation, of what the Pod Pro is really capable of with an all analog setup. To get the lush 8200 chorus back in the equation, we'll have to, of course, kill the stereo output on the pod, dial in the appropriate preset with the amplifier you want, and give the mono effects return of the Marshall the signal that you want from the Pod Pro. And the final signal chain configuration, of course, going back to a Pod Pro preset using the tube preamp. Let's turn that output back up, but kill the mono signal going to the Valvestate. Again, we won't need the chorus here. Be turned on, it doesn't really matter. And we'll have the preamplifier loop turned on. And that way we can get some line 6, late 90s, early 2000s delay and modulation effects. And that's going to wrap up the B-side Pod Pro Tone Engineer. This one was quite a bit of fun, quite a bit of frustration involved as well. Getting a lot of these signal chains to work at the same time was not obvious. I wanted to have that kind of as a challenge to myself, but also to show that, you know, this stuff is kind of more capable than we might give it credit for in ways that is again, it's not obvious. But especially since the last 8200 rig I did, you know, I had a diagram to go off of and show, hey, look, this worked in real life, so I'm not going to bother trying to do all this, you know, switching and nonsense and making the signal worse as a result. I'm just going to show you the end tones. I kind of wanted to be able to show that, hey, this does work, and here's how. But with that said, I do feel like it's almost a bit of a shame. The preamps on board, the 8200, at least the high gain one, and some of the less authentic Pod Pro preamp models aren't more remarkable, because if you're going to go through all this trouble, they all better sound pretty remarkable, you know. The rectified sounds awesome, even the Brit high gain's pretty good, and with enough boost, this thing does the, you know, kind of 8100 thing, but it's not quite there. And so I think if you had like a, you know, something that really emulated a power amp, a tube-driven power amp, or there was a tube-driven power amp in here, that would improve things. Or if you had maybe the next generation Pod Pro or X3 or something that you preferred over this, that would add another wow factor that I felt was missing in some of these demonstrations. Likewise, some of the effects really aren't as wide as I'd want them to be. And of course, you could, you know, manipulate some of this stuff in post to sound better, or even just throw some delay on one side of the microphone in, you know, a live scenario. And again, you'd get a good sound. Despite all that, altogether, it still sounds really freaking cool. And if I didn't have to, you know, go through all these switching nightmare scenarios to get it to work, this would have been a really cool rig to have played with when I was younger, because I was kind of going after this just in an inadvertent way. The, I guess, real way to do this, if you want to make a professional version of it, is instead of having all these kill switches and things you got to tap dance on, you'd want like a loop switcher like I have on my real pedal board, and one that has kind of a MIDI output would be preferable to be able to operate this thing. So you could do this for real, but again, in the world of multi-effects and amp modelers, it's just, there's no need to do this crazy shit anymore. You're better off, if you want to use a real amplifier, putting some type of multi-effects floorboard in 4-cable method with an amp head, or even 7-cable method with, you know, a stereo solution, and you're going to have a much easier time, a much better sounding time than this, especially in terms of the noise issues. As I've been alluding to throughout the video, this will probably be the last time that I really deep dive into either the Pod Pro original or the Marshall Valvestate 8200. I will definitely be hanging on to the Pod Pro. I've had it for about 6-7 years at this point, unbeknownst to most of you, and it serves its role, even though the drive pot really needs replaced. Like, it's an on or off switch at this point, though through MIDI I can mitigate that. And it'll be, you know, joining my original Bean as kind of a keepsake for that generation of tone. When it comes to the 8200 though, as I said in the past, as nice as it is to have this stereo solution and a really cool sounding chorus, it doesn't do anything that I can't replicate anywhere else. And the preamplifier simply isn't as good as the 8100. I hate that fact, but it is a fact. So with that, this thing will be going up for sale soon, probably the moment this video releases or the moment I'm done editing it, and I'm for sure that I don't need any other pickup shots. But I will say that if you are interested in buying it, you know, I'm going to be kind of my own worst enemy here and tell you that it's not as good as the 8100. It is a cool platform, and if you want to do the 90s Meshuggah rig type thing with it, or like what I'm doing here, it is definitely the one to get. But this particular specimen, it needs some work. It came in the exact same condition that I have it now. It's missing a nut here, and there's some oddness sometimes, just sometimes, with the output of this amplifier, even though I had no issues shooting or reamping any of the sessions for this particular video. In the past, there have been times where one of the outputs just like wants to cut off in like the left or right channel. I don't know why. I'm kind of going to mark which output of the, at least the left and right speaker outputs, works basically every time for me. But that is all to say, I can't guarantee this thing doesn't need some work. In fact, like I did my 8100, I would probably expect to put, you know, $150, $200 worth of parts and labor in this. The caps probably need, you know, swapped and that kind of stuff. And at the end of the day, it's still not going to sound like the 8100. So again, probably too transparent, but if someone is interested in it, I want it to go to a good home, and I'm not looking to make a killing off of it. I just kind of want to get close to what I have in it and what I think is worth the repair. Because between that and selling off the Boss Katana, I want to fund some not only future gear for this channel, but some upcoming expenses for music production, upcoming expenses for going to rock and roll festivals, and of course other adult expenses that aren't 1% as fun as any one of those things. So that's all to say, you can wave goodbye to the 8200 more than likely after this video and catch it on my Reverb shop if you are interested. Hopefully the shipping isn't as terrible as I think it's going to be. With that, any other questions or comments, leave them down below. Hope you enjoyed this dive into some now vintage gear as much as I did. We'll see you next time. Bye.